Welcome back to part 2, Protecting the Holy Grail, with Deuby, Principal Technologist from North America for Semperis. I think organizations do understand the risk, and they just, in my mind, they didn't have something in at their disposal that they can easily deal with that risk. Because what you described earlier, it's really convoluted and extremely detailed and a lengthy process of recovering, looking at it. So most organizations, they have accepted the risk. It's like, okay, I'll deal with it when it comes with it. And that's what we describe as MGN and Dallas and other incidents where the organizations, I'm sure they came to realize right now that they could have done a better job. And according to some research, what you mentioned earlier on Kerberos and Kerberos tickets, known as Kerberos, so the attacks actually increased in 2023 by almost 600%. So it's known vulnerabilities, it's hard to deflect, and you describe very succinctly that your tool can help deal with it during attack. So it's definitely something to look for, and some of it also when organizations are building all those ginormous moats and trying to put layers and layers of protection in front of Active Directory and trying to protect. The reality is every single report that I've read, whether it's a global threat report from CrowdStrike or data breach, Verizon data breach report that they publish every year, predominant factor right now and exposure for all organization, it's account credentials. And you briefly touched upon it, that, all the threat actors go around and they scour for all those data dumps looking for credentials. So it takes just one account that can be easily obtained, compromised, or people not using passwords the way they're supposed to, and they're short or they repeat it. They found this, and through passwords dumping and password stuffing, so they finally get hold of some credentials for organization, and then they go to Kerberos or any other exploit vulnerabilities, and they make their move, and they get the data or whatever they need, and then we read the news about somebody is being held for ransom because their data leaked out. So there are 5, I think, themes in this particular area, or 5 vectors, we can call it, that could be succinctly talked about. It's account credentials. That's the one I described. Then there's another vector that threat actors are taking. It's API keys and secrets. So they steal them and they try to reuse them through the sessions. And then session cookies and tokens and one-time password. So, and the last one was Kerberos that you described very well. Do you mind to talk about one at a time or all of them? How would Semperis deal with them, and how would this particular tool and advent that your organization bringing forward to deal before, during, and after would assist with identifying those threats? Because again, if you talk about account credentials, most EDR tools, they don't know an account was compromised, whether it's myself or somebody who is acting on my behalf with my stolen credentials, gain access, and there's, one-time passwords can be bypassed too through all this technique known as smishing. When you get a bunch of different text coming in, finally you give up and you just say yes, press OK, and you authorize somebody's account. So it happens more often than we would like to hear it, but let's say we just have to be prepared at certain things. Nothing is bulletproof in cybersecurity. Threat actors always looking for new ways to find how to get in, and we're trying to find new ways how to deflect them. So from that point of view, how do you see like account credentials, API keys, session cookies, one-time passwords? How would Semperis play into it?
So I think an important aspect, and this has been kind of largely a doom and gloom conversation, an important thing that I feel it's important to bring out is you can still do a lot to protect yourself in this situation. I think that things are your understanding of a threat actor's intentions clarifies quite a bit if you go back to what their goals are versus what your goals are. Of course, their goals are, and I'm talking about cybercrime here. I'm not talking about nation state actors, but cybercrime, which is what most of us are probably more top of mind than feeling like we're going to be attacked by nation state, depending on what kind of a organization you are, what vertical you're in. Threat actors' goals is to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, with as little interference from law enforcement as possible. And if you take those goals and you work backwards, you can pretty see of the evolution of cybercrime is simply adhering to how they can better achieve those goals. So if you take that in terms of every possible spectrum of way you could be attacked, and I was a technology journalist for many years, and I know that in incident reports or in cybersecurity articles, no one wants to hear about the same old boring stuff again and again and again. It's novel attacks are always better for views and clicks and information. But the reality is, if you map back to what the threat actor, cybercrime actor wants to do, is make as much money as possible as quickly as possible and move on to the next organization. So that means the same old vulnerabilities every time. What gets them in more quickly than anything else? And I think that is part of the reason we are seeing such an increase in curb roasting, for example. Why should a threat actor that wants to make as much money as quickly as possible go into some sophisticated technique when they can use a set of credentials, log on to a server, use Mimikatz to harvest administrative credentials in the environment and get domain admin and game over? Or they can get onto any client in Active Directory and execute this curb roasting attack, gain privileged access, game over. So what my message here is, and I jokingly call this eat your vegetables. You always hear people, saying, eat your vegetables, it's good for you. Well, do your basic cybersecurity, it's good for you. For example, curb roasting. It's extremely effective against service accounts with weak passwords. So the guidance, and again, I'm going to harp on downloading Purple Knight because it will tell you this. Go to your service accounts and make strong passwords for your service accounts. Passwords that, let's face it, users are not logging on to service accounts. So you can make these really gnarly, long, highly entropic passwords that a threat actor, when they export it, can't crack it. So that's basic protections to protect you against these ways that the cybercrime actors are most likely to do it. When I have in my own podcast and I talked to a Microsoft Dart incident response consultant, he said the vast majority of attacks are done against internet-facing gateways, as I've described in the past. They get in, they crack passwords, and they move on real quickly. If you have a difficult environment to get around, again, it's a time and money thing for the threat actor. If they have to spend days and days and days to gain privileged access in your environment because you've made it just a little bit tougher than the next one, these guys spent $400 for a set of credentials to get into an environment. Given what they can make in a return for extorting a company, it's like, all right, this is taking me too long. I'll spend $400 for another set of credentials, and I'll move on to the other environment. So as a way of framing this conversation, yes, I believe these other ways are used, but my advice is to eat your vegetables and go you do basic controls in your environment, and don't just say it's not possible to protect your environment. It is. Now that said, sorry, I didn't answer your individual items on that.
No, that's fine. People need to eat their vegetables, so
Right.
organizations need to take care of basics. But definitely, it's yes, there was an increase, and you described it pretty well. So threat actors not there to loot their money. They there to make their money, and they don't care which way they want to make it. And they go with a path of least resistance. And if Kerber
Exactly.
this is what gives them most of income. That's what they're gonna do until organizations move on and
They have to use
essentially,
something else.
yeah,
Um,
implement controls. And sometimes simple control can take care of the situation. But from your perspective, you talked about this big serious incidents like MGM. They spent a lot of money dealing with this simple yet not so simple problem when somebody tricked their help desk in resetting passwords. And let's say, how, if you played this attack hypothetically, how would software or tool like Semperis would be able to detect this problem? Because traditional, I wouldn't call, they have next generation, they have traditional, all this endpoint detection and response tools. They not gonna be able to detect when somebody's credentials were either reset or compromised and somebody else is using them. It's like, how would somebody utilizing your tool would be able to tell the stories like, hey, we have a problem here, there's credentials, it seems like they've been compromised, and here's a threat actor. Because yes, all other things, when it happens, if active directories get contaminated or something happens, you go through the painful recovery, and definitely your tool shines there to bring it up. But I think this onset of an attack, when it's detected in the right time, saves a lot of grief and expenses at the end.
right. Right. I mean, so imagine, and again, we're speculating because we don't know exactly what happened with MGM, but in any, let's say, some generic environment, the threat actor gains privileged access. And I'll just throw out one scenario. The threat actor gains privileged access, and the first thing that they do is they kick out all of the other administrators. You know, how do you kick out the threat actor who has become the sole administrator, and you're no longer the sole administrator, and you're no longer an administrator to counter strike? And in the case of Directory Services Protector, you have the ability to use DSP to actually undo the threat actor's changes, where he's removed all of the users from the administrative groups, and in fact, remove their access from from administrative access. Or more generically, whatever changes you see, changes are happening in the environment where you can see that um, servers are being encrypted, or backup services are being corrupted. It's pretty apparent who is making these unauthorized changes. And the advantage of a tool like Directory Services Protector is that you can roll back these changes that the threat actor is making in real time. And indeed, DSP has the ability to uh, hold rules that will make automatic changes. So, for one of the simplest rules that we have, for example, is that if anybody is added to a privileged group in Active Directory, they are immediately rolled back. A security event is written into our security log, and an email alert can be sent to your SIEM or whatever management system that you have, so that a bad guy literally gets kicked out when they're pulled back in. Or the other way around, when the bad guy comes in, they can be pulled back out. And you can write this rule for many different kinds of changes in Active Directory. And we have organizations that have found that to be very valuable, because when a threat actor is attacking your environment, they're probably not going to do it at 1 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. They're going to do it at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning or over a holiday weekend or sometime when there are fewer people paying attention in the SOC and in infrastructure in general. And we have surveys that have shown that and others, of course, have shown that that's when those attacks tend to happen. And if you have an automated rule, you don't have to wait for somebody being alert in the SOC to see that and try to reverse what's being done.
Got it. Yeah, Sean, you kind of mentioned interesting thing. We always treat in this long, big holidays when they come on from security point of view, like around Christmas or 4th of July. It's like, am I gonna have these holidays, or I'm gonna end up sitting for 12 hours and dealing with somebody who just came in and ruined the whole thing?
That's
Yeah,
that's why when we work with retail organizations, it's all hands on deck before the holiday season, and no changes and everything is absolutely locked down and everybody is watching very carefully.
yeah, definitely, and especially when somebody is not eating their vegetables and they left some holes
Right.
open, and then all of a
That's right.
sudden this big exploit comes along, and you have to go into this firefighting mode and quickly pretty much fill those gaps and to make sure that the organization is still safe. So I think you described very well throughout the show. So there's a risk definitely associated, and there is also a benefit. And I think certain things changed in the past, I would say 3 to 5 years in Active Directory, and that's primarily Semperis coming along and bringing all these tools and what used to be extremely difficult to do and painstakingly right now becoming more easier, and protection is available and recovery is available, monitoring is a lot better. So how would we go about convincing senior management, because I think there is still a certain level of fatigue and something that been held from the past where they looked for the past 20 years and like nothing happened. It's like, why do we need to worry about this right now? And what benefit is going to give us? And I think that's kind of part of the problem where CISOs and head of information security trying to describe the problem, and they're not articulate enough to help understand the risk and help understand that there are opportunities to deal with this risk and mitigate, because we cannot reduce any risk to zero. It's like, so from your point of view, what you see in organizations you talk to, how would you suggest all this executive management team or CISO especially approach executive management team and make their case that yes, things were great and we were keeping our hands in the sand, but we may not be keeping them for too much longer, and here's something that we can buy to reduce the risk, or here's how we can reduce the risk and take those meaningful steps, including eating your own vegetables, or make sure things are good and you've done all you can, and then additional layers you can put in place to mitigate risk further to certain level better than just, okay, we'll do nothing except the way it is.
Well, from my viewpoint, it's very logical. And let's take it apart from the risk analysis equation, which would help if I had it up here somewhere. But from the risk analysis equation, how do you mitigate risk? Well, number one, you have vulnerabilities. Okay, so mitigate the vulnerabilities as much as possible. Eat your vegetables. Download Purple Night. Let it show you where your biggest vulnerabilities are and work on mitigating those vulnerabilities. Great. Number two, the active attack area. What's going on in the active attack area? Don't put your head in the sand. Know that they're going to come through Active Directory. So if they're going to come through Active Directory, how do you mitigate that risk of them going through Active Directory and making changes to encrypt your environment or to eject them from having domain dominance? You need to look at a way to be able to do that, because with native out of the box Active Directory, you really can't do that at the pace that the threat actors will be working at. You need the ability to roll back some of these changes. And I didn't really talk much about Entra ID. And I'll talk about that in a second, but let me finish the risk equation for on-premises times the impact of Active Directory being down. And as I said, the area that's not quite as well appreciated is how long it takes to get Active Directory back up again. Again, this is a factor of here's the risk, here's the cost. How do you mitigate this risk? Because, and so much of this is about human nature. The human nature that says, well, we have an Active Directory recovery plan on paper. We haven't tested it for quite a while. And I do surveys when I do webinars and I talk to organizations. And the percentage of organizations that have an Active Directory cyber-focused disaster recovery plan that they test regularly is quite small. And so the reality is, okay, does it really work in a cyber scenario? And have you really gone through a hardcore test to show that you can do this as you hope it does? Human nature is, oh, I think we're pretty good. Well, you can't afford to be, oh, I think we're pretty good. You have to be able to really, really mitigate that risk. And the last part that I said I've neglected saying anything about is with Entra ID. So there is a significant risk in Entra ID that I think most organizations still are not quite aware of. And that is what Microsoft calls the shared responsibility model. And in it, and you can look up Entra ID and shared responsibility model on the web. And what you'll come up with is a page on the Microsoft site that says, basically, Microsoft, we're responsible for the tenant and control of the tenant. And if something bad happens to the tenant, a threat actor gains control of it. If you sufficiently prove your credentials to us, we will give you control of the tenant back. What we are not responsible for is the data in the tenant, the configuration in the tenant. You are responsible for that. So what that translates to is that there's a function called soft delete in Entra ID for users, Office 365 groups, and applications. And maybe there's one more by now. And it's good for 30 days. So if an administrator inadvertently or a threat actor intentionally changes or deletes, not changes, if they delete any of those, they can be recovered up to 30 days afterwards. Anything else in Entra ID, conditional access policies, roles, any of the other myriad objects, computer objects in Entra ID are deleted or changed. There's no rollback. There's no way to fix it. It's as if the analogy I like to use is if you have a car and your car is stolen, and the police recover your car. The police will recover your car, but they may have, but the thieves may have burned the back seat and dumped a load of garbage in the front seat. The police say it's not our responsibility. Here's your car. Same thing with Microsoft. They will return the tenant to you, but you are responsible for your data in that tenant. Much of the data has come up from Active Directory as a synchronized users in Active Directory, but it's a little bit of a description to get into it. But even that, an administrator with a couple of wrong clicks on Entra Connect ID, the Entra Connect server, can create the same problem for thousands of accounts. Now, Microsoft has a free tool called Entra Exporter. It's a free community tool, and it will export a lot of that data in JSON format. There is no way to import it. You have to rebuild it all by hand. And so this is a huge risk for organizations that aren't aware that the data that they're not backing up in Entra ID is at risk if an administrator or a threat actor comes in and inadvertently or intentionally makes changes. We also have a solution called Disaster Recovery for Entra Tenant that is designed to address this vulnerability as well. So that's another vulnerability aspect for IT decision makers to be aware of that I still believe that most organizations are not aware of.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, for that. That's definitely helpful, and hopefully the audience could listen and take their notes on what they can and cannot do. Yeah, and it's kind of funny story when you start talking about shared responsibilities and kind of making relevant to
Yes.
the cops. And I remember a friend of mine had his car stolen, so at the end of the day, his car was recovered, and then the police officer came and said, "Oh, I have good and bad news. Which one you want to hear first?" I was like, "Okay." He said, "I want a good news." I said, "Well, the good news, we got your car back." And it's like, "What's the bad news?" "Well, it's a shell. Everything inside was taken out." It's like, okay,
It's
that's
sitting
not
on
the full
blocks.
story.
Yeah.
So it's kind of shared responsibility. So, no,
Yes.
thank you, Sean, for staying with us today for this whole hour, and certainly appreciate it. And we're at the top of the hour right now, so I'd like to see if you have any parting words for the audience that you want to share in terms of Active Directory, Entra, and Semperis, and how they can make the best out of the situation they have.
Sure. Number one, in case you haven't figured it out by now, eat your vegetables. Download Purple Night and find out what you can do to mitigate the vulnerabilities that you have in your environment, in your identity environment right now. Number one. Um, Number two, remember your vulnerabilities around the entrant tenant. And number three, once you recognize those vulnerabilities, and especially the vulnerabilities around recovery as well as anything else, look at what we have to offer and see if that may help mitigate the risks associated with your identity systems and the recognition that the bad guys are going to go after your identity systems when they come into your environment.
Okay, thank you, Sean, for sharing that. And once again, this is Sean Deuby, Principal Technologist for North America at Semperis. And for the audience, thank you for staying with us and joining for this show. Remember, we're stronger together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about these topics or IS Squared, please go to www.issquaredinc.com.